Florida was supposed to be paradise, the American dream wrapped in sunshine, palm trees, and endless opportunity. But somewhere between the postcards and the promises, something went terribly wrong. Right now, as you watch this, thousands of families are walking away from their Florida homes, not because they want to, but because they have no choice. The real estate crisis in Florida isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about dreams that turned into nightmares, savings that vanished overnight, and a system that failed the very people it was supposed to protect. And the worst part? Most people have no idea how deep this really goes. 10 years ago, if you told someone that Florida real estate would become one of the most dangerous investments in America, they would have laughed in your face. Florida meant growth. It meant prosperity. It meant building a life where winter never came and opportunity knocked on every corner. Families saved for decades to buy a piece of that dream. Retirees sold everything they owned up north to move south into the sunshine. Young couples took out massive mortgages, believing that Florida property values only went one direction, up. Everyone wanted in. Miami's skyline transformed into a forest of glass towers. Orlando expanded beyond recognition. Tampa Bay became the next big thing. Fort Lauderdale, Naples, Jacksonville, every city seemed touched by golden magic. Developers couldn't build fast enough. Real estate agents worked around the clock. Mortgage brokers approved loans at record speed. The money flowed like the ocean waves, constant and seemingly infinite. But beneath that glittering surface, cracks were forming. Small at first, easy to ignore. The kind of cracks that people in the industry noticed but dismissed as temporary fluctuations. Insurance companies started pulling out of Florida quietly, one by one. Property taxes began creeping upward, just a little each year. Homeowners associations raised their fees, citing maintenance and reserves. Nothing dramatic, nothing that made headlines, just steady, relentless increases that ate away at budgets month after month. And still, people kept buying, because everyone believed the same lie, that it would all work out, that Florida was special, that the rules of economic gravity somehow didn't apply to the Sunshine State. Then Hurricane Ian hit in 2022, and everything changed. Not immediately, not all at once, but that storm ripped away the curtain and exposed what had been hiding underneath. Insurance claims flooded in by the hundreds of thousands. Companies that had stayed in Florida suddenly faced billion-dollar payouts. Within months, major insurers declared they were done with Florida entirely. Citizens Property Insurance, the state-backed insurer of last resort, became the only option for hundreds of thousands of homeowners. And their premiums? They skyrocketed. A homeowner who paid $3,000 a year for insurance in 2021 suddenly faced bills of $12,000, $15,000, even $20,000 annually. That's not a typo. That's not an exaggeration. That's the reality facing real Floridans right now. But wait until you see what came next, because the insurance crisis was just the beginning. Property values across the state had been inflated by years of speculation, investment buyers, and out-of-state money pouring in during the pandemic. When people could work from anywhere, they chose Florida. No state income tax, warm weather, space to spread out. Demand exploded. Prices went vertical. A modest 3-bedroom home in Tampa that sold for $250,000 in 2019 suddenly listed for $600,000 in 2022. It felt like winning the lottery if you already owned. It felt like getting priced out of your own state if you didn't. Locals who had lived in Florida their entire lives found themselves unable to afford rent in their own neighborhoods. Teachers, nurses, police officers, firefighters, the people who actually kept communities running couldn't compete with remote workers earning Silicon Valley salaries. And here's where the story gets darker. The big institutional investors saw opportunity in chaos. Corporations with billions in capital swooped in and bought entire neighborhoods, paying cash, closing in days, outbidding families who needed mortgages and inspections. They turned single-family homes into rentals, pricing them at whatever the market would bear. In some Florida cities, more than 30% of all homes are now owned by corporate landlords, not individuals, not families building equity and wealth for their children. corporations, hedge funds, investment trusts based in New York, California, even overseas. They don't care about communities. They don't care about schools or local businesses or neighborhood character. They care about returns on investment, about quarterly earnings reports, about squeezing maximum profit from maximum rent. Meanwhile, the people who actually live in Florida started doing the math. Mortgage payment, insurance, property taxes, HOA fees, maintenance, utilities. The monthly cost of owning a median-priced Florida home climbed past $4,000, then $5,000, then $6,000 in many areas. That's $72,000 a year just to keep a roof over your head. For context, the median household income in Florida is around $65,000 before taxes. Read that again. The cost of housing exceeded total pre-tax income for the average family. That's not sustainable. That's not livable. That's a crisis in slow motion. You felt this too if you live in Florida or know someone who does. You've watched friends pack up and move to Georgia, Tennessee, the Carolinas, anywhere that still felt affordable. You've seen the for sale signs multiply on your street. You've noticed the shopping centers with more empty storefronts. You've heard the stories of elderly residents on fixed incomes getting forced out of homes they've owned for 30 years because they can't afford the new insurance premiums. This isn't some abstract economic theory. This is real people losing real homes, real stability, real futures. And the system that was supposed to protect them, the banks and the insurance companies and the government agencies, they're nowhere to be found when it matters most. But here's what nobody talks about, the part that should scare you more than anything else. Florida's real estate market is a house of cards built on sand in a hurricane zone. Think about that metaphor for a moment, because it's not hyperbole. It's literal truth. The state's entire economic model depends on continuous growth, on more people moving in, on property values climbing forever. But what happens when that reverses? What happens when people start leaving faster than they arrive? What happens when the companies that bought all those rental properties realize they can't fill them at the prices they need to profit? What happens when banks holding millions in Florida mortgages suddenly face waves of defaults because homeowners simply cannot afford the carrying costs anymore? The signs are already appearing. Foreclosure filings in Florida increased by 47% year over year in the latest data. Short sales are back. Owners are walking away from properties they're underwater on, owing more than the home is worth, unable to sell for enough to pay off their mortgages. The market is flooded with inventory that isn't moving. Homes sit for months with no offers. Price cuts become routine. First 5% off, then 10, then 15. Desperate sellers do whatever they can to escape before the trap springs shut completely. And those who can't escape, they're stuck in properties bleeding money every month, trapped between a mortgage they can't afford and a market that won't buy them out. Let's talk about the human cost, because that's what this really is. Behind every foreclosure notice is a family. Behind every short sale is someone's retirement dream dying. Behind every eviction is a child changing schools mid-year, a parent taking a second job, a marriage strained to breaking under financial pressure. There's Maria, a single mother working 2 jobs who bought a condo in Fort Myers in 2020, believing she was finally building something stable for her kids. Now her insurance tripled and her HOA doubled their fees for hurricane repairs. She's working 70-hour weeks and still falling behind. There's Robert and Linda, retirees who sold their Pennsylvania home and moved to Sarasota for their golden years. Their fixed income hasn't changed, but their housing costs went up $4,000 a year. They're cutting medications to pay bills, choosing between health and shelter. These stories multiply across the state. In Naples, teachers are living in their cars because rent exceeds their monthly salary. In Miami, essential workers commute 2 hours each way from affordable counties because they've been priced out of the city they serve. In Orlando, families pack 3 generations into homes built for one because splitting costs is the only way to survive. The Paradise Promise has become a pressure cooker of stress, anxiety, and impossible choices. And the cruelest irony? Many of these people can't afford to leave. Moving requires money for deposits, trucks, time off work. When you're living paycheck to paycheck just to keep your current housing, escape becomes a luxury you can't afford. Now, add climate reality to this equation. Sea level rise isn't a distant future threat in Florida. It's a present-day problem. King tides flood streets in Miami Beach regularly. Saltwater intrusion contaminates wells. Hurricanes have intensified. The 2024 Atlantic hurricane season brought record storm surge. Properties that were buildable 20 years ago are now uninsurable at any price. Entire neighborhoods face managed retreat. Government speak for abandoning areas to the rising ocean. But someone still owns those properties. Someone is still paying mortgages on homes that will be underwater literally within decades. Who's going to buy those? Who's going to refinance them? Who's going to bail out the owners when the water comes? The banking sector sees this coming. They're quietly reducing exposure to Florida coastal properties. New mortgages in flood zones come with higher rates, bigger down payments, more restrictions. Some lenders won't touch certain areas at all anymore. They learned from the 2008 crash. They know what happens when an entire regional market collapses, and suddenly nobody can sell, nobody can refinance, nobody can escape their obligations. The difference this time is that it's not just financial engineering that broke the market. It's reality itself. The physics of climate change combined with the mathematics of unsustainable costs. You can't spin that away. You can't securitize that risk and sell it to someone else. It just sits there, ticking like a bomb. And the state government? They're promoting Florida harder than ever. Move here, pay no income tax, live the dream. But they don't mention that you'll pay that tax savings and more in insurance and property costs. They don't mention that public services are strained because workers can't afford to live near their jobs. They don't mention that the electric grid struggles during heat waves because infrastructure hasn't kept pace with growth. They don't mention any of it because growth is the only model they know. Growth brings tax revenue, brings jobs, brings development fees, and economic activity. Admitting the model is broken means admitting they've been selling a fantasy. And politicians don't win elections by telling people their dreams are dying. Here's where it gets truly disturbing. The same dynamics that created the 2008 financial crisis are reassembling themselves in Florida right now. Risky loans, over-leveraged borrowers, inflated asset prices, institutional investors playing with borrowed money, regulators looking the other way, and everyone assuming that the music will never stop. When you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. We've seen this movie before. The warning signs are flashing red. The difference is that this time, there's no cavalry coming to the rescue. The federal government has made it clear they're done bailing out people who chose to live in high-risk areas. Insurance companies are done subsidizing climate-exposed properties. The free market is saying, through prices and pullouts, that Florida real estate at current valuations doesn't make sense anymore. But millions of people are still trapped in the old paradigm, still making decisions based on past performance, still believing that somehow it'll all work out. Let me show you what's coming if nothing changes. Picture Florida in 5 years. Insurance costs have doubled again. Property taxes increased by 40% to cover climate adaptation infrastructure that the state can no longer defer. HOA fees have tripled as buildings age and face repeated hurricane damage. Mortgages continue at their current rates, maybe higher if the Fed raises rates again. The median cost of home ownership reaches $8,000 per month in major metros. The median income has not doubled. It hasn't even increased 20%. The gap becomes impossible. Foreclosures cascade. Prices crash. Equity evaporates. Banks tighten credit further, making it even harder to sell. The market freezes. Thousands of properties sit empty because nobody can afford to buy them at prices that would let sellers escape their mortgages. But nobody will accept the losses required to price properties at what buyers can actually afford. Entire neighborhoods decay. Property crime increases. Services decline as tax bases shrink. The spiral accelerates downward, feeding on itself, destroying wealth and lives and communities in its path. Sound dramatic? Look at what happened to Detroit. Look at what happened to Atlantic City. Look at what happened to countless Rust Belt cities where the economic model broke and nobody fixed it in time. The specifics differ, but the pattern holds. unsustainable costs, declining opportunity, population exodus, tax base collapse, service cuts, further exodus, accelerating decline. Florida isn't immune to this. Sunshine and palm trees don't repeal economic gravity. Math doesn't care about marketing slogans, and right now, the math doesn't work for millions of Florida residents. They just don't all realize it yet, but they will. Some are figuring it out as they open insurance renewal notices. Some will figure it out during the next hurricane season when damages exceed coverage. Some will figure it out when they try to sell and discover that buyers are scarce and lowball offers are standard. Eventually, everyone figures it out. The only question is whether they figure it out in time to make a choice, or whether the choice gets made for them by foreclosure, by disaster, by circumstances beyond their control. But let's talk about the other side, because there's always another side. Some people are getting rich off this crisis. Real estate investors who bought cheap during the pandemic and rent high now. Insurance company executives who collected premiums for years and then abandoned policyholders when claims came due. Developers who built in flood zones, sold before the water came, and moved on to the next project. Mortgage brokers who earned commissions on loans they knew were borderline. Property management companies charging fees on rentals owned by distant corporations. There's an entire economy of extraction happening. Wealth flowing from desperate homeowners and renters to distant shareholders and executives who will never experience the consequences of their decisions. This isn't capitalism at its finest. This is disaster capitalism, profiting from pain, extracting value from crisis, leaving wreckage behind. And you know what makes it worse? The knowledge that this was all predictable. Climate scientists have been warning about this for decades. Insurance actuaries saw the risk years ago. Urban planners knew that building dense developments in flood zones was insane. Economists warned that income growth couldn't support housing price growth forever. None of this is a surprise. It's all documented, all predicted, all ignored because short-term profits mattered more than long-term stability, because growth mattered more than sustainability, because today's sales mattered more than tomorrow's crisis. Everyone made their money, passed the risk down the chain, and walked away. Now, regular people are holding the bag, owning the risk, paying the price for decisions they didn't make and warnings they were never told about. The psychological impact of this crisis extends far beyond finances. Home ownership in America represents more than shelter. It represents security, achievement, building wealth for your children, having a stake in your community, being part of something stable and permanent. When that gets ripped away, when your home becomes a liability instead of an asset, when the dream curdles into a trap, it damages something fundamental in people. Depression rates are climbing. Anxiety disorders are epidemic. Relationships fracture under financial stress. Children absorb their parents' fear even when the parents try to hide it. The social fabric tears when people lose faith that working hard and playing by the rules actually leads anywhere. And that's what's happening in Florida right now. People did everything right. They saved, they bought, they maintained their properties, they paid their bills, and it doesn't matter. The system broke anyway. The promise was a lie. So where does this end? There are a few possible scenarios, none of them pleasant. Scenario 1, government intervention at a massive scale. Federal bailouts, insurance subsidies, mortgage relief programs, managed retreat funding. Essentially, taxpayers nationwide paying to fix Florida's crisis. Politically unpopular, especially in states that don't face these risks. Unlikely to happen at the scale needed. Scenario 2, market correction. Prices crash, wiping out equity, but eventually finding a new equilibrium at affordable levels. Painful for current owners, but it resets the market for future buyers. Banks take huge losses. Some fail. Another financial crisis ripples through the economy. Possible, but devastating. Scenario 3, slow bleed. Prices decline gradually, never crashing, but never recovering. People slowly walk away. Population slowly declines. Florida slowly becomes less economically important. No dramatic moment, just steady decline over decades. Depressing, but perhaps most likely. Scenario 4, climate acceleration. Major hurricane, catastrophic flooding, something that makes the crisis acute rather than chronic, forces immediate decisions and massive displacement. Nobody wants this, but given current storm trends, it's increasingly probable. None of these scenarios involve happy endings where everything returns to normal. Normal is over. The Florida that existed from the 1950s through the 2010s, that era of endless growth and sunny optimism, that's done. What comes next depends on choices being made right now by policymakers, by lenders, by insurers, by individuals. But time is running out to make good choices. The longer everyone pretends this is temporary, the worse the eventual reckoning will be. Denial doesn't stop hurricanes. Denial doesn't lower insurance premiums. Denial doesn't create affordable housing. Denial just delays and amplifies the pain. If you're watching this from Florida, you're probably feeling some combination of anger, fear, and vindication. Anger that this happened. Fear about what it means for you. Vindication that someone finally said out loud what you've been thinking. You're not crazy. You're not overreacting. This is real. This is serious. This is not going away. And you need to make decisions based on reality, not marketing. Look at your actual costs. Look at your actual income. Look at your actual prospects for both increasing in ways that make the math work. Be brutally honest. Can you afford to stay? Not can you scrape by for another year. Can you afford to stay long-term, absorbing further cost increases, weathering storms, maintaining property, paying the bills without destroying your health and happiness and future? If the answer is no, or even maybe, you need to consider your options now while you still have options. Waiting until you're in crisis makes every choice worse. If you're watching this from outside Florida, thinking this doesn't affect you, think again. Florida is the canary in the coal mine for climate-exposed real estate nationwide. What's happening there is coming for coastal California, for Gulf Coast Texas, for low-lying Louisiana, for hurricane-prone Carolinas, for flood zone anywhere. The specific details will differ, but the pattern holds. Climate risk plus insurance crisis plus inflated prices plus economic inequality equals disaster. Learn from Florida. See what happens when everyone assumes it'll work out. See what happens when growth becomes the only goal regardless of sustainability. See what happens when short-term profits matter more than long-term stability. And then demand better from your local leaders. Demand actual planning. Demand honest risk assessment. Demand policies that protect residents rather than developers. Because if you don't, you'll be living through your own version of this crisis soon enough. Empty tables, empty streets, empty dreams. That's what parts of Florida are becoming. Not everywhere, not yet, but in enough places that the pattern is clear. The restaurants that catered to middle-class families are closing because those families left or can't afford to eat out anymore. The shops that relied on local spending are shuttered because nobody has disposable income. The sense of community that made neighborhoods feel like home is dissolving as people move away and strangers move in, or nobody moves in and homes sit vacant. The soul of place, that ineffable quality that made somewhere feel worth living, is eroding under the pressure of pure economic calculation. When everything becomes about dollars and cents, about investment returns and profit margins, about squeezing maximum value from minimum investment, something human gets lost. Something worth preserving dies. But maybe there's still hope. Maybe seeing the crisis clearly, naming it honestly, understanding its roots and its trajectory, maybe that's the first step towards solutions. Not easy solutions, not painless solutions, but solutions that acknowledge reality and work within constraints rather than denying both. Maybe Florida finds a way to build affordable housing at scale, to restructure its insurance market, to invest in climate adaptation while managing retreat from indefensible areas. Maybe the federal government steps in with a comprehensive plan rather than waiting for total collapse. Maybe local communities organize to protect residents rather than profits. Maybe individuals make smart choices to preserve their futures rather than clinging to dying dreams. Maybe, but maybe requires action. Maybe requires courage. Maybe requires admitting that the old way is broken and new approaches are necessary. We saw it happen. We watched the dream state turn into a stress state. We saw families crushed by costs they couldn't control. We saw communities hollow out. We saw the promise break. Now the question is, what comes next? Does Florida become a cautionary tale of what happens when growth and profit trump sustainability and people? Or does it become a model of how to navigate climate and economic crisis with humanity and intelligence intact? Right now, it's heading toward cautionary tale. But there's still time, barely, to change the trajectory. That requires honesty about the problem, creativity about solutions, courage to implement them, and political will to prioritize people over profits. Can Florida do that? Can America do that? Can we collectively face hard truths and make hard choices before crisis makes them for us? The answer to that question matters for far more than Florida real estate. It matters for how we face every complex challenge coming in this century. It matters for whether we build a future worth living in or just extract maximum value from a dying present. It's time we remember what home actually means. Not an investment vehicle, not a speculative asset, not a line item on a corporate balance sheet. Home is where you build a life, where you raise children, where you put down roots and become part of a community, where you create memories and stability and belonging. That's what's being destroyed in Florida. Not just property values, not just equity, but home, the dream of home, the reality of home. And once that's gone, once millions of people learn that home is just another commodity that can be taken away by forces beyond their control, something fundamental breaks in the social contract. Trust dies. Hope dies. The belief that working hard and playing fair actually leads somewhere, that dies too. And what rises from those ashes? Anger, cynicism, desperation, the kind of emotions that tear societies apart rather than hold them together. Florida isn't just experiencing a real estate crisis. It's experiencing a crisis of meaning, of purpose, of faith in the fundamental structures that make civilization possible. And that should scare you more than any price chart or insurance premium. Because that's the kind of crisis that spreads, that metastasizes, that consumes everything it touches until nothing stable remains. If you felt this change too, share your story in the comments. If you're living through this right now, you're not alone. And if you found this eye-opening, subscribe, because the next story might reveal where everyone's going next when paradise becomes impossible. The crisis is real, the pain is real, but so is the need for truth, for community, for holding on to our humanity even when the systems around us fail. That's what matters in the end. Not what we owned, but who we were when everything fell apart. Whether we helped each other or exploited each other. Whether we faced reality or denied it. Whether we built something better from the wreckage or just walked away and let it burn. Florida is deciding that right now. So are we all.